The origins of the Japanese language are still quite obscure. Linguists cannot agree on the language family it belongs to. Neither do they agree on the original language or languages it might have derived from. What we know is that since it started being written, the Japanese language has barely changed. What you learn or what you speak in the 21st century is still quite close to what was spoken 15 centuries ago, even though Japanese apparently had more vowels then than it does now. It is usually considered that the Japanese people started writing around the 4th or the 5th century AD, even though, depending on the sources, the Chinese characters might actually have been brought into Japan in the 1st century. Unlike what is generally assumed, the Chinese characters called kanji in Japanese were not immediately used to transcribe the Japanese language. At first, texts were written in Chinese, probably by bilingual Chinese or Korean officials that were employed at the Yamato court, at least until the Japanese themselves became fully versed in classical Chinese. This might have happened during the reign of Empress Suiko, as during her reign, the Yamato court started sending full-scale diplomatic missions to China, which helped increase Chinese literacy among the people working at the court. Like in any other country at the time, writing and reading were regarded as scholarly activities practiced only by the very few. Alongside status, gender also played a part in the equation, and in this regard, men were particularly privileged. During the Heian period, the Kanbun system of writing emerged. Kanbun, or Han writing, describes the adaptation of classical Chinese texts into understandable Japanese. The original text in classical Chinese was not modified, but it was rather adapted with the additional markers or diacritics which could be understood by the Japanese people. This was the general writing style of male officials and intellectuals at the time. Over time, the Japanese people started using kanji to transcribe their own language too. Of course, they started by using the Chinese ideograms that had an equivalent meaning in their own language. However, over time, this proved insufficient. Consequently, and probably to make things a little bit easier, they moved away from ideographic characters towards phonetic characters. This means they separated the original kanji from its meaning to only keep the sound of the character. This is what is called Manyougana, a system consisting in writing the Japanese language using only the sound of the kanji. Even though we don't know for sure when it was invented, it is generally assumed that the system dates back to the 7th century. Even though Manyougana was invented to simplify reading, the system itself was not standardized. Some authors would still use certain characters for their meaning, while other authors would use one specific kanji to represent a specific sound, which was represented by yet another character by another author. Needless to say, this made things even more complicated. Without going too much into the details, over time, in order to alleviate the confusion, the kanji that were used as Manyougana eventually developed into katakana and hiragana. At the time, hiragana was disregarded as not worth the time of the highly educated or the men of the court who would devote their time to the study of classical Chinese. On the other hand, it was regarded as perfectly suitable for women, as many of them were denied access to a similar education as men, even though many women were still taught classical Chinese. Hiragana, which was born out of an oversimplification of Manyougana, first gained popularity among women, and more specifically, it spread among court women. They would use the syllabary to write their personal correspondence or to write literature. Consequently, the script was called women's hand, or Onnade. The Heian period was a key period for the aristocracy in Japan. During that period, the Japanese language embarked on a major development phase as Japan began its modernization. And despite their lower status at the time, women actually played a most important part in this development. At the time, women were confined to private spaces. The upper-class, higher-educated women had no part to play in the turmoil of public affairs, and had thus a lot of time on their hands, during which they were particularly bored. They were actually so bored and lonely that they had to make up fantasy worlds to live a life they would not experience in reality. That's why they started writing, using the language in which they could best express themselves to convey their thoughts and feelings. Even though some female writers at the time did use the Chinese characters in their works, the Hiragana system of writing was the most suitable to convey natural speech and lively inflections that kanji could not properly render. According to some scholars, it is actually because they were not involved in the public sphere and political affairs that women so successfully managed to develop such an elaborate sense of artistry. Writing in hiragana gave women more freedom and allowed them to mirror natural speech in their writing. This is probably the reason why the works witnessed significant popularity among the people, spreading throughout the country over the years. Of course, these gender distinctions are not set in stone. As I said earlier, some women did know classical Chinese. Conversely, some men did write using the Onnade style. However, this was more problematic for them as the Onnade was particularly disregarded. They thus had to find some tricks to bypass this social pressure. One of these tricks was just pretending to be a woman. The most famous case of a man writing in the Onnade style at the time is undoubtedly the Tosa Diary, written by Kino Tsurayuki. Interestingly enough, the Tosa Diary is regarded as the first notable example of the Japanese diary as a work of literature. Before this work became widely known, the word diary, or Nikki in Japanese, usually referred to official records of government that men would write in Kanbun. In this work, Tsurayuki assumes the persona of a woman to express his sorrow over the death of his daughter. By using a female point of view, the author was able to avoid the use of Kanbun and could instead focus on his Japanese prose. The Pillow Book is one of the most famous works of the classical Japanese literature. It is a collection of observations, essays, personal thoughts, and anecdotes that were recorded by Sei Shonagon when she served as court lady to Empress Teishi in the 990s and 1000s. Since the book is not a work of fiction, Shonagon's observations about her contemporaries or the life at the court make the book a valuable historical document. Interestingly enough, the book was never meant to be disclosed to the public, but it was accidentally found at the court during her lifetime. The Tale of Genji, or源氏物語, is probably one of the most well-known works of the classical Japanese literature worldwide, as it is regarded as the world's first psychological novel. It tells the story of Hikaru Genji, the emperor's son, who was removed from the line of succession, and it recounts much of his romantic life while describing the customs of the aristocratic society of the time. The tale was written by Murasaki Shikibu, a novelist, poet, and lady-in-waiting at the imperial court in the Heian period. Her time at the court was probably used as an inspiration for many of the scenes described in the tale. Within a century, the book had acquired fame across most of the provinces of Japan, and it is now studied as a classic of the Japanese literature. This work is remarkable in many respects. Not only is it a good insight into ancient court life, but it also demonstrates a fierce ability to read into people's emotions as much as it is a psychological criticism of the habits and customs of the past. Despite women being below men in social importance during the Heian period, These times were still beneficial to Japanese women of the upper class as it allowed them to learn how to read and write, which cannot be said of the medieval times. So, female authors at the time produced some of the works that would mark the Japanese literature forever. Unfortunately, in later centuries, female authors almost fell into oblivion. One of the reasons might be that men themselves started using the Onnade style in their writings, probably because of its popularity among the people. Another reason might be that a more militaristic period followed the Heian period, and women who did not have any role to play on the battlefield were not really in a position to write tales of war. In spite of this, the diaries that were written during the Heian period continued to wield significant influence on subsequent writings. Even though women did not play any role in the political sphere at the time, it is thanks to their writings that life in Japan in the Heian period is still known today. We could thus say that even though women were silenced in the public sphere at the time, their voices have traveled through time and are now more prominent than their male counterparts. Of course, Hiragana already existed in the Heian period, but we can say that the female writings of that period breathed life into the syllabary and brought it into true existence, thereby allowing the Japanese language to thrive.